The citation is still on file. It says 5 vital Japanese destroyers sunk in 5 short-range torpedo attacks, 5 enemy warships, 4 days, 1 American submarine. Picture the water, a strait so narrow a ship cannot turn around in it, so clear that from the air a submarine shows through the surface like a bruise under skin. And the guns of an entire Imperial fleet riding at anchor 6 miles away, close enough that the men in that boat could hear the enemy pinging for them through their own hull. That is where one American captain stopped running. He never touched the metal. By the time the words were typed, he was already lying somewhere under the South China Sea with 79 of his crew. But there is a line in that story nobody reads out loud. After the war, when American officers went through the Japanese naval records, ship by ship, name by name, they could only account for 3. 3 destroyers, not 5. So where did the other 2 go? That question has been sitting in the archives for 80 years. The answer is not that Commander Samuel Dey lied, and it is not that the Navy got the paperwork wrong. The truth is stranger than both. Because in those 4 days, one submarine sank something that could never be listed, never be salvaged, and never be replaced. The Japanese knew exactly what they had lost that week. They simply could not put a name on it. Before we start, I just want to say thank you for being here. Did you grow up hearing stories about World War II? Yes or no? He was not supposed to be there at all. Samuel David Dey was born in Dallas, Texas, on the 13th of September 1906. His father died when the boy was 6 years old. His mother packed the children west to California for a while, then brought them home again, and Sam Dey grew up in a city of dust and cattle money and long flat horizons, about as far from deep salt water as an American boy can get. His uncle was George Dey, the newspaper man, the name that still hangs over a plaza in that city. The family was known, the boy was not. He spent 2 years at Southern Methodist University. Then, in the spring of 1925, he walked through the gates of the United States Naval Academy at Annapolis, Maryland, and inside of a year the Navy sent him home. His grades were not good enough, that was all. No scandal, no disgrace, just a young man who could not keep up with the mathematics, packing a bag and walking back out the same gate he had walked in through. Hold on to that, because it matters. The officer of the Imperial Japanese Navy would eventually hunt with entire squadrons of warships. The man they would come to believe was not one man at all, but a whole wolf pack. Began his naval career by failing out of school. He came back in 1926. He tried it again, and in June of 1930 he graduated, in the exact middle of his class. Not near the top, not near the bottom, the middle. There is nothing in his record from those years. Not one line in one fitness report that would make you look twice. A quiet Texan with a slow voice and a slower smile. The kind of officer who gets a competent evaluation and a reasonable assignment and disappears into a long, forgettable career. 14 years later, an admiral of the combined fleet of the Empire of Japan would be sitting in front of a map of the Sulu Sea, trying to work out how many American submarines were out there in the dark, because the number he kept arriving at did not make any sense. The number was 1. To understand what Sam Dey did, you first have to understand the rule he broke, and you have to understand that it was not a stupid rule. It was a good rule. It was written in the blood of men who had learned it the hard way. By the spring of 1944, every submarine officer in the Pacific knew the arithmetic by heart. A Japanese fleet destroyer could run at better than 30 knots on the surface, cutting the sea open like a knife through canvas. A submerged American submarine, pushing her batteries as hard as she dared, might make 9 knots, and only for a little while, before those batteries went flat, and she had to come up into the daylight and die. A destroyer carried guns and listening gear, and rack after rack of depth charges, every one of them designed and built and loaded for exactly one purpose, which was to find a steel tube full of men and crush it flat. A submarine carried torpedoes designed for slow, fat merchant ships that could not shoot back. So the rule was simple, and the rule was honest. If a destroyer found you, you went down. You went deep. You rigged for silent running. You shut off the pumps and the fans and the air conditioning, and you told your men not to speak and not to drop anything. Then you lay there in a hot black steel pipe 600 feet under the ocean, sweating through your shirt, listening to the propellers pass over your head, counting the charges as they came down, and hoping the men above you were guessing wrong about your depth. Running was not cowardice. Running was mathematics. Between the attack on Pearl Harbor and the early months of 1944, Japanese escorts and destroyers had killed American submarines steadily and efficiently. American submarines had done terrible damage in return, but they had done it to freighters, to tankers, to troop transports, to the soft merchant arteries that fed the Japanese war machine. They stayed away from the warships. Warships were faster, warships were armed, warships were hunting you. Sam Dealey did not like the arithmetic. On the 13th of April 1944, north of the Western Carolines, the Japanese destroyer Ikazuchi found the submarine USS Harder. She did exactly what she had been trained to do. She turned her bow toward the periscope and she came on hard, bow first, so that the narrowest possible target was showing, so that no torpedo could get a decent angle on her, so that in 90 seconds she would be directly on top of the American boat and the depth charges would start rolling off her stern. Every man in Harder's conning tower knew what came next. Down, deep, quiet, prey. Dealey held her at periscope depth. He did not turn. He did not dive. He put the crosshairs on that oncoming bow and he stood there and let a warship built for the sole purpose of killing him close the range to 900 yards, which is a little more than half a mile, which at that speed is barely any distance at all. Then he fired 4 torpedoes. 2 of them struck her amidships. Ikazuchi broke apart and went under in about 5 minutes. The message Dealey sent afterward went around the Pacific Submarine Force, and it has never really stopped going around. It was 1 sentence long. Expended 4 torpedoes and 1 Japanese destroyer. In the wardrooms and the officers' clubs and the smoky bars of Fremantle, Western Australia, where the American submarines came home to rest, men argued about that sentence for weeks. Some of them called it the future. They said Dealey had seen something the rest of them had been too frightened to look at, that the destroyer's greatest weapon was not her depth charges, but the fact that every submarine captain in the world was terrified of her, and that fear was a thing you could turn around and use. Others called it something else. They said it in lower voices, over a second drink. They said Sam Dealey was going to get 80 men killed. Both groups were right. That is the part of this story that does not fit comfortably into a newsreel. Both of them were exactly right, and inside of 5 months, everyone would find out. While the Americans argued, the Japanese were counting. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, had a problem he could not solve with courage. He was losing destroyers. He had been losing them for months, to submarines, to aircraft, to attrition in a war that was chewing his navy down to the bone, and destroyers were the one thing he could not afford to lose, because destroyers were what kept his aircraft carriers alive. And Toyota needed his carriers alive, because he was betting the entire war on them. The plan had a name. It was the decisive battle the Imperial Navy had been dreaming about since before the first shot was fired, the single hammer blow that would smash the American fleet in open water and force the United States to the negotiating table. To throw that punch, Toyota gathered everything he had left into one anchorage in the southern Philippines, a place called Tawi Tawi, sitting in the Sulu archipelago between Borneo and Mindanao. What he assembled there was everything the empire had left in one place: battleships, including the greatest battleship ever built, fleet carriers, cruisers, and the destroyers, ring upon ring of them, the shield around the sword. If it floated and it mattered, it was riding at anchor in that harbor. There was only one problem with Tawi Tawi, and it was the kind of problem that does not appear on a chart. To get anywhere from Tawi Tawi, a ship has to pass through narrow water, straits, passages, places where a fleet cannot spread out, cannot zigzag freely, cannot do anything except file through in a line like men walking down a corridor. Which is a wonderful place to be if you are the man standing at the end of the corridor with a gun. In Fremantle, Vice Admiral Charles Lockwood, who ran the American submarine force in the Southwest Pacific, had a fairly good idea of what was gathering at Tawi Tawi. He needed eyes on it. He needed to know what came in and what went out and when. So he wrote out the orders for Harder's 5th War Patrol, and this is the part almost nobody remembers. Nowhere in those orders was Samuel Dey told to sink destroyers. He was told to go and look. He was told to report what he saw. And he was given a second job, a quiet one, a special mission tucked into the paperwork like an afterthought. Off the northeast coast of Borneo, there were 6 Australian coast watchers, men who had been living in the jungle behind Japanese lines, radioing back everything that moved. They had been out there too long. They needed to come home. Harder was to go in, pick up the 6 of them and bring them out alive. That was it. Reconnaissance and a pickup. A taxi run. On the 26th of May 1944, USS Harder slipped her lines at Fremantle and went to sea. Painted on her, in the way of a boat that had come to believe in itself, was the phrase her crew had made their own. Hit them again, Harder. There were 79 men aboard her. Farm kids and machinists and radio operators and torpedomen, most of them in their early 20s, all of them volunteers. Every one of them knowing that the submarine service killed a higher share of its men than any other branch of the American armed forces, and every one of them having signed up for it anyway. They thought they were going out to look at a harbor and pick up 6 Australians. In 11 days, the commander-in-chief of the entire Japanese combined fleet would be looking at a map of that harbor and coming to a conclusion that was completely, catastrophically wrong. And it would cost him an empire. The water around Tawi Tawi is not open ocean. It is a maze. Islands, reefs, shoals, and between them the passages, narrow tongues of deep water threading through shallow coral. Sibutu Passage is one of them. It runs between the island of Sibutu and the northeast shoulder of Borneo, and in the first week of June 1944, it was one of the busiest and most heavily patrolled stretches of water on the planet, because everything the Japanese fleet needed had to come through it, which meant everything the Japanese fleet needed had to swim past Sam Dey. He took Harder in, and he did not leave. Day after day, in shallow, clear, tropical water where a submarine can be seen from the air like a bruise under skin, he stayed. He watched. He counted ships. He wrote down courses and speeds and times. He did the job Lockwood had given him. And on the 6th of June, the hunters found him. A destroyer came out of the haze and turned toward the place where Harder was, and she began to come in. Nobody aboard Harder needed the situation explained. The men in the control room were watching the depth gauge, and the men in the engine rooms were waiting for the order, and the men in the torpedo rooms had their hands on the loading gear, and every one of them was doing the same arithmetic in his head that submariners had been doing for 3 years. Destroyer, faster than us, better armed than us, built to kill us. Go deep, go quiet, take what is coming and hope it misses. Dey took her to periscope depth and stopped. Understand what that means. He did not run. He did not descend. He brought his boat up to the shallowest, most exposed, most fragile depth she could hold, close enough to the surface that a wave could break over the periscope and give him away, close enough that a spotter in an aircraft could look straight down through the clear tropical water and see the black shape of a submarine lying there like a stone on a table. And then he waited for the destroyer to come to him. He watched her grow in the periscope. He watched the white bone of foam at her bow get bigger and bigger, and he called out the ranges in that flat Texas voice, and the plotting party worked the angles, and the men in the forward torpedo room stared at the tubes and listened to the propellers coming, and the propellers got louder and louder, and Dey did not move. You have to sit inside that conning tower for a moment to feel what it cost. It is a space smaller than a bedroom, crowded with men and steel and gauges, and it is hot. tropical hot, the kind of heat that soaks a khaki shirt through in the first 10 minutes and never lets it dry. There is condensation running down the bulkheads. There is the smell of diesel and hydraulic oil and sweat and old coffee and the sour breath of men who have been breathing the same air too long. Nobody is shouting. That is what surprises people about submarine combat. It is not loud. It is a series of quiet numbers spoken in flat voices by men who are terrified, and the discipline of that quiet is the only thing holding the boat together. And underneath all of it, coming through the hull, through the water, into the soles of their shoes, the sound of the propellers, turning, coming closer, getting into their teeth. Every man in that compartment knew that if the captain was even slightly wrong about the angle, or the speed, or the moment, they were all going to die in the next 2 minutes, and every one of them stood at his station and did his job and said nothing. Then he fired. The first torpedo did not do it. The second did not do it. The third one did. The destroyer Minazuki took the hit and she came apart. And inside of a few minutes there was nothing left on that patch of water but oil and wreckage and the sound of a ship dying below the surface, which is a sound submariners describe with a strange, awful reluctance, because it does not sound like an explosion. It sounds like a building collapsing very slowly underwater, a long groaning tear of steel as compartment after compartment gives way and the sea comes in and takes what is left of the men inside. Every man aboard Harder heard it through the hull. Then came the bill. Because sinking a destroyer in a narrow passage 6 miles from the largest concentration of enemy warships in the Pacific Ocean does not end a fight. It starts one. The other escorts came, and Harder went down, deep, into the black, and the charges began. There is no honest way to make what happens next sound heroic, so here it is plainly. 79 men lay in a steel tube in total darkness. In heat you could taste, breathing air that was going stale and sour, while somebody above them dropped explosives into the water and tried to guess how deep they were. The lights go. The emergency lamps come on, and they are the color of a dying fire. When a charge is close, the hull moves. It actually moves. Steel that is supposed to be the only thing between you and 400 feet of ocean bends inward and then springs back, and dust and paint chips and cork insulation come raining down out of the overhead onto your face, and somewhere in the boat a gauge glass cracks, and a valve weeps, and a thin needle of seawater comes through a fitting at a pressure that will take a man's hand off. And you cannot do anything, you cannot shoot back, you cannot move fast, you cannot even talk. You lie there and you count and you wait, and you look at the man across from you, and neither of you says the thing you are both thinking. That went on, and then it stopped, and Harder was still alive. Most captains would have taken the boat and left. They had a kill. They had survived the counterattack. There was no shame in going home, and no orders demanding they stay. Sam Deely stayed. The next day, the 7th of June, the destroyer Hayanami came down the same passage. Deely saw her, set the problem, closed the range, and fired. And the torpedoes hit her amidships, and Hayanami's back was broken. She went down stern first, tail first, standing up out of the water for a moment, the way a ship does when the sea takes her aft end and her bow lifts toward the sky, and then she slid under, and she was gone. 2 destroyers, 2 days. And now, for the first time, something began to change in the mind of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Because put yourself behind the Japanese charts for a moment. You are an officer of the combined fleet. You have concentrated everything you have left, everything the Empire has, at Tawi Tawi. And your destroyer screen, the shield around your carriers, is being taken apart. Not by a wolf pack, not by an air raid, by something you cannot see, in your own front yard, in the narrow water, where nothing is supposed to be able to hide. And you cannot replace what you are losing. That is the poison in it. A destroyer takes years and steel and shipyard capacity that Japan no longer has, and by the middle of 1944 the Empire is burning them faster than it can build them. Every hull that goes down in Sabutu Passage is a hole in the fence around your carriers that will never be filled again. Not this year, not next year, not ever. And it gets worse than that, because a fleet at anchor is not a fleet at rest. A fleet at anchor is a fleet that has to train. Those carriers were crowded with young pilots who had barely learned to find their own flight deck. Boys pushed through a shortened syllabus because the veterans of the early war were all dead, and they needed hours in the air. And hours in the air meant carriers steaming into the wind in open water. Nobody was steaming anywhere. Not with submarines in the passages. So the pilots sat, the flight decks stayed still, and the air crews who were about to be thrown against the American fleet in the largest carrier battle ever fought were losing, day by day, the only thing that could have saved them, which was practice. You start pulling destroyers off other duties. You put them into hunter-killer groups. You order the patrol aircraft up. You flood the passages with escorts, and the reports come flowing back into your headquarters. And every one of those reports says the same thing. Submarine contact. Submarine contact. Submarine contact. The reports pile up on the desk of Admiral Toyota, and Toyota does what any sane commander would do with that much evidence. He adds it up, and the sum he arrives at is that the sea around Tawi Tawi is crawling with American submarines, that the anchorage is surrounded, that the Americans have somehow ringed his fleet base with a cordon of boats and are picking his escorts off one at a time, and that the moment his carriers try to sortie through those passages, they will be swimming into a wall of torpedoes. It was a perfectly reasonable conclusion. It was supported by every scrap of evidence he had, and it was wrong. There was one submarine. One. 79 men in a steel tube with a Texan at the periscope, and they had just convinced the commander-in-chief of the combined fleet of the Empire of Japan that he was surrounded. That is the thing Dey was really sinking out there, and it did not have a name, and it never appeared on any list. He was sinking their certainty. He was taking away the one thing a fleet cannot fight without, which is the belief that it knows where the enemy is. But Harder was not finished, and here is where the story turns. Because on the 8th of June, in the middle of all of that, Sam Dey had to stop hunting. He had a second set of orders. He had a taxi run to make. 6 Australian coast watchers were waiting on the northeast coast of Borneo. 6 men who had been living behind Japanese lines, in the jungle, with a radio, for longer than any man should have to. They had been promised a ride home, and the boat that had been sent to give them that ride was USS Harder. So on the 8th of June, with the sea behind him full of hunter-killer groups, with aircraft in the sky looking for exactly the periscope wake he had been leaving all week, with 2 destroyers dead on his account and every warship in the region wanting him, Sam Dey took his submarine into shoal water near a hostile coastline, and he surfaced. Think about what that means for the men in the boat. Surfacing is the most naked thing a submarine can do. On the surface you are a slow, thin-skinned ship with almost no guns, sitting still, visible for miles to anything with eyes. And they were doing it next to an enemy shore, in a region where the enemy had every destroyer he could spare out looking for them. They got the 6 Australians aboard. They took them below. They brought them out. Picture those 6 men coming down the ladder into that boat. They had been in the jungle for months, sleeping in the mud, watching the sea through binoculars, eating whatever the villages could spare, and now they were being handed down a hatch into a hot metal corridor that smelled of oil and men, with a submarine crew looking up at them, and above their heads the hatch shut and the sea closed over the whole thing. And somebody would have told them, the way sailors do, without any particular drama, what boat they were on. This is Harder. This is Dey. You can imagine the silence that followed. Because by the 8th of June, in that region, that name had already begun to mean something. 2 destroyers gone in 2 days. Every Japanese escort in the Sulu Sea out looking for the boat responsible, and these 6 men, who had spent a year staying alive by not being seen, had just been rescued by the most conspicuous vessel in the Pacific Ocean, and now Harder was carrying passengers. Understand exactly what changed. Up to that morning, every risk Dey took was a risk taken by volunteers. Every man aboard had chosen the submarine service knowing the odds, knowing that roughly 1 in 5 of them would not come back, knowing what they were signing. The 6 Australians had not signed anything. They were not submariners. They had no station, no job, no training, nothing to do when the charges came except sit on the deck plates in the dark with strangers and feel a steel hull flex around them and understand, in a completely helpless way, that their lives were now in the hands of a man they had never met, who had a reputation for charging destroyers. Any reasonable officer, with 6 civilians aboard and 2 destroyer kills already in the log, would have run for Australia. The mission was accomplished. Both missions were accomplished. Nobody in Fremantle would have said a word. Sam Dey turned back toward Tawi Tawi. This is the part of the story where you have to decide what you think of him. It is the part where the newsreel voice would tell you about the fighting spirit of the American submariner. But sit for a second with the actual weight of it. He had 6 men aboard who could not consent, and he took them back into the killing ground because he thought there was more to be had there. He was probably right about the military value. He may well have shortened the war, and he was also gambling with lives that were not his to gamble with, and he knew it, and he did it anyway, and there is no version of this story that is honest and also comfortable. On the 9th of June, Harder was back in the passage. And on the 9th of June, Dey did the thing that is still difficult to believe when you read the record. He was operating in confined water. The Japanese fleet base was roughly 6 miles away. 6 miles. That is not a patrol area, that is a doorstep. Aircraft overhead, escorts sweeping, and 2 Japanese destroyers came through on patrol, and Dey did not evade them. He attacked both of them. 2 patrolling destroyers, one after the other, in quick succession, in a strait so tight the water itself was working against him. His own report described death blows on both. 2 ships hit, and so far as anyone aboard Harder could tell through a periscope in the middle of a running fight, 2 ships finished. One of them was the destroyer Tanikaze. That is not in dispute. Tanikaze went down on the 9th of June 1944. The second one is where the arithmetic that would puzzle historians for 80 years begins. Hold that thought. We will come back to it, and the answer is not what you think. Then came the 10th of June, and the 10th of June was worse than everything that came before it, because on the 10th of June they saw him. Not a lone destroyer, not a hunting pair, a large enemy force, warships in formation, and their screen had a fix on the American submarine, and it was coming. There was nowhere to go. He was in narrow water. There was no deep ocean to run into, no thermal layer to hide beneath, no cover, no distance, nothing. A destroyer detached from the screen and turned her bow directly at Harder and began to close, coming in bow first, the way they always did, the way Ikazuchi had, and this time there was no clever solution, and no time, and no depth, and no room. So Sam Dey did the only thing he knew how to do. He turned his own bow, and he pointed it straight at the ship that was coming to kill him. They call it a down-the-throat shot. It is exactly what it sounds like. The destroyer is charging you head-on, so you charge her head-on, and you fire your torpedoes directly into the closing gap, and then you get out from under her. Understand the geometry of that, because the geometry is the entire terror of it. When 2 ships are heading directly at each other, the range collapses at the sum of both speeds. Every second is worth double, and a bow-on destroyer is the smallest target in naval warfare, a thin blade of steel coming at you edge-on, so if your torpedoes are off by even a little to either side, they will run past her flanks and hit nothing at all. And if you miss, she is still coming. She is coming at 30 knots, and you are directly in front of her, and she is going to be on top of you in less time than it takes to read this sentence. She will drop her charges right onto your head at the exact depth you are trying to reach, or she will simply run you over. There is no second attempt. There is no evasion afterward. You fire, and then you fall out of the sky and hope your boat is fast enough going down. Dey fired 3 torpedoes from his bow tubes. Then he crash dived. The bowplanes bit, the boat tilted, and harder went down hard with an enemy warship's propellers thundering directly above her, and the men in the control room held on to whatever they could reach, and in the forward torpedo room they listened to the water rushing over the hull and to the sound of the destroyer coming, and in that moment there was absolutely nothing anyone aboard could do except be inside a machine that was falling and pray it fell faster than the ship above them could react. And then the sea exploded. The torpedoes found her. The destroyer blew up, above them and around them, while harder was still passing beneath, and the shock of it picked the submarine up and shook her like a dog shakes a rat. The record says the boat was rocked terrifically as she passed underneath the exploding ship. That is a naval officer's phrase. Here is what it means. 79 American submariners and 6 Australian civilians were directly underneath a warship at the moment it detonated. The hull rang. Men were thrown off their feet. Anything not bolted down came loose, and harder kept going down, into the dark, alive. Nobody cheered. That is worth saying, because in the movies they cheer. In a real submarine, after a thing like that, there is a long moment where men simply stand where they are, holding on to a valve wheel or a bunk frame, breathing, and then somebody starts checking his compartment for leaks, because that is the job, and the job is what keeps a man's hands from shaking. Somewhere in that boat there were 6 Australians sitting on the deck plates with their backs against a bulkhead. Nobody had asked them, nobody had explained. They had felt the hull ring like a struck bell, and they had understood, in the only way it can really be understood, that the man at the periscope had just aimed his ship at an oncoming warship and dived underneath the wreckage. And the boat kept going down, and the water pressure kept climbing, and the sea above them closed over another dead ship, and Sam Deely went back to his charts. 4 days. 6 torpedo attacks against destroyers. The Imperial Japanese Navy, in that stretch of water, had ceased to function as a navy. It had become a mob of frightened ships hunting a phantom. And in the plot room of the combined fleet, Admiral Toyota was now certain of something. Tawi Tawi was surrounded. The passages were death. The greatest fleet Japan had assembled since Midway was sitting at anchor in a trap, and every hour it stayed there, it was being bled. He had to get his carriers out. He would move them, and he would move them before he was ready, and he would send the pride of the Imperial Navy out through those straits and into the Philippine Sea, with its preparation unfinished, its screens scattered, its air crews half-trained. He was about to make the decision that lost him the Pacific Ocean, and he was making it because of one submarine that was, at that very moment, running low on torpedoes and running low on fuel and quietly turning south for home. On the 13th of June 1944, the Japanese Mobile fleet weighed anchor and left Tawi Tawi. They went because they could not stay. The passages were haunted. The escorts were dying. The pilots had not flown. And the most powerful naval force Japan had assembled since Midway went out through those straits and into the Philippine Sea, carrying a battle plan that was no longer finished, a screen that was no longer whole, and air crews who had spent the crucial weeks of their lives sitting on a motionless flight deck. 6 days later, on the 19th of June, they found the American fleet. Or rather, the American fleet found them. The Japanese launched wave after wave of aircraft, hundreds of young men in the sky, most of them barely trained, flying against American pilots who had been flying and shooting for 2 solid years and who were waiting for them, with radar, with numbers, and with a fighter direction system that put them exactly where they needed to be. The Americans who watched it from the flight decks did not call it a battle, they called it a turkey shoot. In 2 days, the Imperial Japanese Navy lost the heart of its carrier air power and never got it back. Taiho went down. Shokaku, one of the veterans of Pearl Harbor, went down. Hio went down. The Japanese carriers survived in a physical sense, some of them, but the thing that made a carrier dangerous, the men who flew off it, was gone, and Japan could not make more of them. That was the end. Everything after the Philippine Sea was Japan losing more slowly or losing faster. And a great deal of that traces back through those straits, back through those 4 days in June, back to one submarine that had frightened an admiral into moving before he was ready. Sam Dey brought Harder home. He came back to a wall of decorations, to an admiral's handshake, and to a reputation so large by then that other captains were reading his patrol reports like scripture. Before the war was over, he would hold 4 Navy crosses, which is a sentence that should stop you, because almost nobody in the history of the United States Navy has ever held 4. In the submarine force, he had become the man who proved the arithmetic could be beaten, the destroyer killer. They should have kept him ashore. They should have put him behind a desk in Fremantle and made him teach. They did not, and he would not have gone. There is a thing that happens to men who survive something they should not have survived. It does not look like fear. It looks like the opposite, and that is what makes it so hard to see coming. Dey had walked into the tightest, most heavily defended water in the Pacific, with an entire enemy fleet 6 miles away, and he had walked out again, and the boat had held, and the men had held, and every single time he had bet the lives of everyone aboard on the belief that the other man would flinch first. Every single time he had been right. That is not a lesson. That is a habit. And a habit is a very dangerous thing to carry into a war that is learning as fast as you are. The men who came back to Fremantle with him that summer went ashore into sunlight and clean sheets and cold beer and the strange, floating unreality of being alive. Some of them wrote letters home that they could not say anything true in, because everything true was classified. Some of them slept for a day and a half. Some of them lay awake listening to the ordinary sounds of a building and hearing propellers in them. And then the boat was repaired and refueled and rearmed, and they went back. On the 5th of August 1944, Harder sailed on her 6th war patrol, working with the submarines Haddo and Hake in the waters off Luzon. It went well at first. Convoys were hit. On the 22nd of August, Harder and Haddo took on Japanese escort vessels and put 2 of them down, the frigates Matsuwa and Hiburi. Then, on the 24th of August, off Dassault Bay on the western coast of Luzon, Harder and Hake found 2 more enemy ships. One was a Japanese escort, a coastal defense ship, a small purpose-built submarine hunter. The other one was a ghost. It had begun life as an American destroyer. It had been built in an American yard, crewed by American sailors, and it had been scuttled in a dry dock in the East Indies in the terrible first months of the war, when everything was falling apart. The Japanese had raised her from the mud, repaired her, and put her back to sea under their own flag as a patrol vessel. She was the former USS Stuart. So on the last morning of Sam Dey's life, the ship closing on him through the water off Luzon, working in company with the escort that would kill him, was a warship that had once flown the Stars and Stripes. The escort found Harder first, and that escort did not do what Japanese destroyer captains had done in June. It did not hesitate. It did not flinch when the submarine came at it, and it did not make the one mistake that Dey had built his entire career on. Because the Japanese had spent 3 months learning, they had studied what happened at Tawi Tawi. They knew now that there was an American boat out there that ran toward destroyers instead of away from them, and they had worked out what to do about it. The depth charges went into the water. Aboard Hake, submerged nearby, they heard it. A long, hard, precise pattern of explosions, and then nothing. No sound of a submarine getting away. No sound of anything. Think about the men in Hake for a moment. They were listening on sound gear to a boat they knew, a crew they had drunk with in Fremantle, a captain whose name every submariner in the Pacific said with something close to awe. And they heard the charges go down, and then they heard the ocean go quiet, and there was not one thing on earth they could do about it. They could not surface. They could not search. They could only stay under, and stay silent, and wait, and then, eventually, write it down and take it home. Harder was hit below the surface, and she did not come up. Whatever happened inside that hull happened in the dark, and it happened fast, and it happened to all of them. 79 men, Every officer, every sailor. Samuel David Dealey, 37 years old, from Dallas, Texas. The Japanese circled the spot and reported oil on the water, and wood, and cork. There were no survivors. There was nothing to bury. In Texas, they eventually put up a stone with his name on it, but there is nobody underneath it, and there never was. His name is carved instead on the walls of the missing in Manila, along with the names of the men who went down with him, because that is the only address any of them have. And so the tactic that broke the Japanese fleet in June is also the tactic that killed him in August. The same aggression, the same refusal to run, the same absolute confidence that the other man would blink first. In June, they blinked. In August, they did not. Now, about those 5 destroyers. The Medal of Honor citation, the highest thing this country can write about a man, says it plainly. 5 vital Japanese destroyers sunk in 5 short-range torpedo attacks. And when the war ended and American officers sat down with captured Japanese records to match every claim against every hull, they could confirm 3. Minazuki on the 6th of June, Hayanami on the 7th, Tanikaze on the 9th. The others do not appear. They were hit. Men aboard harder watched them break and burn and stop. But somewhere in the confusion of a periscope view, in a strait full of smoke and wreckage and other ships, the accounting slipped, the way it slipped for submarine crews on both sides of that war 100 times over. So the honest number, the one the archives will support, is 3 sunk and others savaged. And it does not matter even slightly, because the thing Sam Dealey actually destroyed off Tawi Tawi was never a ship at all, and it was never going to show up on anybody's list. He destroyed the belief of the Imperial Japanese Navy that it controlled its own water. That is what he sank. Not 5 hulls. He sank the confidence of a fleet, and he did it so completely that the commander-in-chief of that fleet looked at his charts and saw submarines everywhere and got his carriers out of there before they were ready, and sailed them straight into the worst defeat in the history of Japanese naval aviation. You cannot salvage that. You cannot rebuild it in a shipyard. Once a navy stops believing the sea belongs to it, it never gets that back, and Japan never did. On the 22nd of May, 2024, 80 years after she went down, a team of underwater explorers found USS Harder. She lies in the South China Sea at a depth of about 3,750 feet, sitting upright on the bottom, remarkably intact, exactly as she was when she was lost. There is a large hole in her port side, just aft of the conning tower, where the sea came in. She is a war grave. Nothing will be raised, nothing will be touched. The 79 men are still aboard her, at their stations, in the dark, where they have been since the morning of the 24th of August, 1944. They were mostly very young. They were farm boys and mechanics and radio operators and teenagers who had lied about very little except how ready they were, and they had volunteered for the most dangerous service in the American military, and they had followed a soft-spoken Texan into water no sane man would enter, and they had won something that changed the shape of a war. And then they had paid for it, all of them, together in one morning, in one boat. The Japanese never did figure out what hit them at Tawi Tawi. They kept looking for the wolf pack. They kept plotting the cordon of submarines that had ringed their anchorage and picked their escorts apart. There was no wolf pack. There was one boat and 79 men, and a man who had once been sent home from Annapolis for not being good enough. And there is no list anywhere in the world that has room for what he took from them.